Hello, everyone. I'm Milton Mueller. I'm a professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology, and I run the Internet Governance Project here in Atlanta, in the USA. As many of you may know, I'm a veteran of Internet governance processes, global Internet governance processes, both within ICANN and in the World Summit on the Information Society. And I'm happy to record a talk for the D4G Labs event on the Global Digital Compact promoted by the UN. I do have some perspectives on that. I don't know if you will like them. They're pretty critical, but I think they're worth hearing, and I wish I could be there to discuss it with you directly, but I can't. So let's start first with the road from the World Summit on the Information Society, which sort of started in 2001 and ended in 2005. I say ended, but it seems like WSIS is never ending. We're now approaching WSIS plus 20. But somehow we've gone from internet governance to digital governance. And I think, in fact, that is a correct form of evolution because as we've learned in the last 20 years, the internet is really part of a broader digital transformation. And internet governance cannot really be separated from data governance, software governance, and the governance of digital devices, such as semiconductors. All of these now are part of a broader digital political economy, and isolating internet and talking about governance at the global level for just the internet is a little bit arbitrary. Now, in the World Summit, we learned, at least I learned firsthand, that there's this huge tension in the United Nations system. All right. So on the one hand, there are people, many of them civil society advocates, some governments, who look upon the UN as a global welfare state. And they think of it as something that is going to deliver benefits and redistribute wealth and lift up the poor and institute international equality through the institutions of the United Nations. And certainly the rhetoric and the activities of the UN would suggest that. And actually some of the stuff they do, like a lot of their emergency things or the World Health Organization or various forms of international cooperation around emergency, around aid, those are in fact sort of fitting into that paradigm. On the other hand, you have to recognize that the United Nations is an institution that was formed as a compact among nation states. That is, it is a way of delegating and sharing power among sovereign nation states that goes back to the end of World War II. And as an intergovernmental institution, you have to understand that the UN is not free of geopolitical tensions, and that the level of collective action and cooperation that you're going to get from the UN system is very much dependent on the interests and the capabilities of the nation states who are members of the UN. And then, of course, there are major power imbalances or differences between all of these nation state members. So if you have this welfare state attitude, you think of maybe the UN as this benign, public interested institution that's looking out to help everybody. But if you understand it as a compact among competing sovereign nation states, then you realize that states are not neutral, benign entities, that they have their own interests, that they have competitive power interests in particular, and sometimes that leads even to fights, to violence and war, although it can also sometimes lead to cooperation. So keeping that disjunction in mind, let's now turn to what we might say is the role of governments and the UN in digital development. Now, the first point I want to make, again, it's something that doesn't make me popular among the crowd of people who participate in these international institutions, is that the relevance of the UN and of international institutions generally is vastly overstated in most of these documents, including the Global Digital Compact. What we have to understand about digital development, or in fact, all forms of economic development and technological development, is that it is the market. It is the allocation of capital. It is the exchanges of private households and businesses in the market that drives about 80 to 90% of all development. I mean, we just have to accept that as a baseline. You can debate that, and there would be lots of scholarly literature about that, but I'm stating that as something that as a historian and student of communications history, this is just something that comes across very clearly, that if you want to develop a digital economy, it's going to be markets, private capital, private households buying things, saving money, accumulating wealth. That, more than anything else, is going to determine the distribution and the development of information and communications technologies. Now, secondarily, the second most important element is, in fact, the national government, which has authoritative power over a national economy and can impose coercive regulations on the people and the businesses within their jurisdiction. Of course, the power of national governments is limited and constrained by the global economy, by the ability of people to exit, by the ability to attract investment and capital. But fundamentally, national governments do set their own regulatory frameworks, and they do have the authority to put people in jail, to tax people, to regulate things in a way that the international system simply does not. And so that brings us to the third most important part of digital development, and that is, in fact, the intergovernmental organizations. They are really, for the most part, entirely dependent upon national governments to implement whatever norms or whatever rules they develop. They are entirely dependent on national governments for their budgets. They get donations from the rich countries, and that may be anything from the United Arab Emirates to the United States, but they're fundamentally dependent on their budget on national governments. And so we cannot, again, overstate the role of the UN and its Global Digital Compact in digital development when they call for doing things like eliminating all divides. All right, I'm sorry. Insofar as we're going to get greater distribution of wealth in the economy generally, much less in the digital economy, it's going to happen either through growth, autonomous growth within a national economy, or through national programs to redistribute wealth. It's not really going to come from the UN, because the UN does not have the authority to tax and to redistribute wealth. In line with this approach, I also want to caution, you hear a lot of people talking about a UN takeover of the internet, or how the authoritarian states are using the UN to do one bad thing or another to the rest of us that are outside of their jurisdiction. These concerns also are highly overstated. You cannot come up with really a single example in which a UN decision has had a major impact on the freedoms or the lack of freedoms of internet or digital citizens in other parts of the world, right? It's just Again, whatever the UN does, whatever it implements is entirely dependent on national governments and what they do, as well as constrained by market forces and the ability of consumers and businesses to avoid sanctions, avoid regulations. So I mentioned earlier that governments are, in fact, self-interested actors. They are not these benign, angelic entities that are just looking out for the public interest. They do have their own interests. And part of what's going on with the Global Digital Compact is simply that the United Nations bureaucracy, notably the Tech Envoy's office in New York, is trying to maintain and promote the relevance of the United Nations, which in some ways is perfectly natural. I mean, we're all giving them money, we're paying people to work there. They need to do something to justify their existence. And what they do time and again over the decades is they jump on some newly developing issue. 20 years ago, it was internet governance. Now it's AI and the digital economy. And they say, hey, we're here. We really want to lead the world in taking the digital economy in a good direction. Whether they have the ability to do that or not is a separate question, but they certainly would like to position themselves as leaders in this space. So they have an interest in perpetuating their own relevance and their own funding. And we have to be aware of that. And take what they do with that little grain of salt in mind. So moving on to that, you need to look at the Global Digital Compact really as a list of norms and nothing more. It is a bunch of governments and negotiators and the bureaucracy getting together and saying, from the bureaucracy standpoint, how can we position ourselves to be leaders and to justify our existence and to perpetuate our funding? And for the standpoint of the national government diplomats who are negotiating these things, it's all about their own sort of interests in articulating certain norms that will justify their policies and their actions. So I have to say, as cynical as I might sound about intergovernmental processes, there actually is some value in this aspect of the United Nations. Particularly when you look at something like the Internet Governance Forum, which breaks out of the mold of purely state-to-state dialogue and negotiations and includes potentially everybody. There's a great deal of value in having a forum where people can talk about things and exchange ideas and exchange information and look at different kinds of best practices. And as long as this dialogue is unconstrained by the idea that this is going to be a law, that I'm going to be imposing something on you, we're just purely talking together and figuring out, what's the best thing to do. I think this has a lot of value. And I think this is one thing that the UN can do, can host almost better than anybody else. Now, I say almost because, in fact, there are lots and lots of forums for the discussion of digital issues that are outside of the UN and don't need to be part of the UN. And I'm not just talking about ICANN, which is narrowly focused on a set of governance issues related to the internet registries, the name and address registries, but academic conferences, other intergovernmental organizations like the OECD, even the BRICS forums, those are bringing together people, mostly governments. But there's lots and lots of different ways in which people can get together and try to have exchanges of ideas and try to coalesce around certain norms. Now, the good thing about the Global Digital Compact is that these norms get written down and they get negotiated. And so you can see where people stand on these issues. The problem with negotiating norms in this way is that norms are very, very easy to say wonderful things, right? Everybody should have digital technology. Everybody should be rich. Everybody should be safe. Women and men should be equal. There should be no inequality in the world. That's very easy to say, but how do you do it? And is the United Nations in any position to do this? What do you think? So with that in mind, let me just now go through some of the objectives, which I would call norms, that have been advanced in the Global Digital Compact and make some brief comments about them. So the first one is, objective one is, let's eliminate all divides, close all the digital divides, and accelerate progress across the Sustainable Development Goals. Well, number one, you are never going to close all digital divides. There are always going to be differences. And actually, the more rapid the development of any economy, whether digital or not, is going to probably increase the dispersion of different groups. Now, ideally, it's a rising tide that lifts everybody, but the idea that we will all be at the same level, will all be equal in terms of wealth and capability, that just isn't ever going to happen. And actually, we probably don't want it to happen because these differences among people often facilitate divisions of labor and specialization that actually contribute to development. For example, somebody who's really good at accumulating capital and investing it, you don't necessarily want you will need some concentrations of capital in order to be effective at investing it. Now, by inequality, I don't mean, oppressive inequality where some people are forcibly held down and their opportunities are denied. I simply mean that if you have a free and open economic development, you are not going to get equality, you are going to get a greater dispersion in the economic status of the population. And the only way to get around that is to have some kind of centralized wealth redistribution mechanism, which can, in fact, shut down economic development and lead to authoritarian forms of control of people because you're taxing everybody's wealth and in putting it in the hands of a government that may not be very good at redistributing it, that may keep it for itself. And I know that's an unpopular position, but I really think that needs to be said. Now, what about objective 2 in the Global Digital Compact? Let's see, what we have here is expand inclusion in and benefits from the digital economy for all. Well, again, that's something that it's very easy to say. Who can argue with that? Who wants to expand exclusion? Who wants to deny benefits? I mean, sure, that's great. The question is, how do you do that? And what they propose is really a bunch of adjectives, right? We want to foster an open, fair, inclusive, and non-discriminatory digital environment for all that enables micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises to access and compete in a digital economy. Okay, how? Call on all stakeholders where requested to provide technical assistance to developing countries. Okay, well, there are lots of technical assistance programs out there already. Some people do that, some people don't. The UN has really not in much of a position to enhance that capability. But again, it's nice to have a norm negotiated in which that is made explicit. So let's move on to objective 3, foster an inclusive, open, safe, and secure digital space that respects, protects, and promotes human rights. Now, when you start talking about human rights and the digital economy and the digital environment, this is where we reach maximum hypocrisy, really. Because again, everybody says they're for human rights. And as I look around the world today, particularly in the digital space, I see massive violations of human rights that the United Nations and other states are really not doing anything about and probably cannot do anything about. I mean, just look at what's going on in, the Middle East, where you have, a horrible attack on Israel, followed by a massive and disproportionate response that's killing tens of thousands of people in Gaza. Uh, where are our human rights protectors? Why is that happening? Now, if they can't deliver human rights on something of that magnitude, how are they going to protect human rights in the digital world where all kinds of censorship is taking place, where the Chinese are imprisoning Jimmy Lai for running a critical newspaper and putting him in jail for life simply because he's a political critic of the Chinese government. Uh, and we have the United States passing a law to ban a social media application, TikTok, simply because the corporation that owns it started in China and is run by a Chinese entrepreneur. To me, that's an obvious violation of human rights. What is the UN going to do about that? Really, it's, and furthermore, when the UN talks about human rights, they include a gigantic bundle of things that really conflict with each other, right? Like, for example, the right to development. What the heck is the right to development? I mean, you have a right to freedom of expression. If you take actions to express yourself and somebody stops you, you can say, hey, I have a right to freedom of expression. You shouldn't be stopping me from talking. But if you say I have a right to development, all right, what does that mean exactly in the international environment? If it means that one country is exploiting and dominating another country and stopping them from developing, then yeah, that's a violation of the rights, basic human rights of property and free exchange. But I think the development is something that happens once you have an effective market economy and not something that is a right and you can just sit back and say, hey, I'm supposed to develop because I have a right to develop. Again, another unpopular position of mine, but something that needs to be said. Let's go on to objective 4. And we start getting into the more substantive areas of the digital compact. So advance responsible, equitable, and interoperable data governance approaches. Well, that sounds pretty good. We need better privacy and security in our digital economy. We need to govern data in a more effective way. But by the same token, data governance is increasingly happening at the national level in ways that is creating barriers between countries. The United States is instituting, which is, US is supposed to be the most liberal country in the world when it comes to the digital economy. And look at what we're doing over here now. We are erecting tremendous numbers of barriers on applications and on services and on devices because we are afraid that the data that is accumulated or generated by these things will be used by our enemies. And we, the World Trade Organization, the idea of free flow of information, many countries are turning their back on that, including India and the BRICS countries, who are refusing to develop trade agreements on information services that allow for open exchanges of data. So, what do these norms mean in a context in which nation states are carving up the world into competing blocks that are imposing barriers on data flow and on the flow of digital technologies like semiconductors? Well, those are the 4 objectives of the digital compact that I'm covering. I think we all need kind of a strong dose of realism in our approach to the digital compact. I don't think we need to be afraid of a government takeover of the internet unless you're talking about your own national government, which really is a threat. But the idea that these international institutions are going to take over the internet is really an exaggeration of the power. Just as the idea that these international institutions or the global digital compact is going to save the world and make it an equal and wonderful place is a massive exaggeration of its power. We do need to maintain the various forms of multi-stakeholder dialogue and cooperation that are facilitated by the United Nations system. I think those are generally good things as long as we understand the limited role of the UN in the actual evolution of the digital economy. Thanks for listening. I look forward to your comments.